Story number 1. I'm a doctor working in an extremely small town. Because the town is so small, our practice really only had 3 doctors. I was the only female working at the practice, so I usually dealt with all of the female patients. The other doctors were male, along with our one receptionist who also functioned as a nurse or assistant. I should say, I never really liked being the only female in the practice. I didn't really have anyone to talk to, and I couldn't make friends with any of my coworkers. I had plenty of friends outside of work, but I felt lonely whenever I was at the practice. Another reason I hated being the only female was how the others treated me. I'd walk into a room and they'd instantly fall silent after laughing and talking loudly with each other. They'd avoid me almost deliberately. They also always insisted that I never take on any of the male patients. On the day of this incident, both of the male doctors were late. I'd arrived early to catch up on some filing, and none of my patients were meant to arrive until late morning. I walked out into the waiting room to find a young boy sitting in one of the chairs. I asked the receptionist about it. He said the other doctors would be there in about an hour, and that he had already told the boy to wait. I instantly thought this was a huge waste of time for the young boy. I was free and fully capable of seeing him. I told the receptionist that, and he reacted in a way that I didn't expect. His mood changed instantly. He insisted that the young boy wait and that I was only supposed to see female patients. Now, I was the doctor at the practice, so there was no way I was taking orders from the receptionist. I ignored him and told the young boy to follow me into my office. The receptionist instantly got on the phone behind me, and I heard him talking to one of the other doctors about it before I closed my door. I started off as usual. I asked the boy what was wrong while I put on my gloves and prepared my tools. It was something simple. He said his stomach was hurting. I figured it was either food poisoning or something similar. I asked him to hop onto the bed and turned around to fetch my stethoscope. By the time I turned back to the boy, he'd already removed all of his clothes and was standing in front of the bed with only his underwear on. As you can imagine, there were a lot of thoughts running through my mind in that moment. I was appalled, angered, confused, and most of all, I was worried. I didn't want to explode at the boy. He looked like he was only 14. I also wasn't about to trust him as far as I could throw him. I asked him what he was thinking and demanded that he put all of his clothes back on. He seemed just as confused as me. That was when he told me that whenever he saw the other doctors, they'd ask him to take off his clothes. A pit formed in the bottom of my stomach. I felt sick. A feeling of guilt for blaming the boy and thinking ill thoughts of him mixed in with my extreme anger and disgust towards my coworkers. Everything started clicking into place. I realized why I wasn't allowed to see any of the male patients. It horrified me to think about how long this had been going on. I locked my door and called the sheriff's office. It wasn't long before I heard my coworkers slamming on my door, but thankfully the sheriff and his deputy arrived shortly after that. The police from the nearby city got involved, and I was called in for questioning. To this day, I'm still not entirely sure of the extent of the case, but I've heard that almost 40 young boys were physically abused and molested by the doctors. The receptionist was in on it all and helped them get away with it. It goes without saying that I don't live in that town or work at that practice anymore. Story number 2. When I was around 10 years old, I was diagnosed with a pretty serious disease. I won't go into details about it because it still confuses me to this day. All I'll say is it caused me to spend a lot of time in the hospital. I'd have to stay as long as a whole week. Because of this, I got really close to all the nurses and doctors that worked on or around me. This went on for years, and by the time I was 16, I had gotten used to it all. I saw the hospital as my second home, and everyone there was like my second family. It wasn't the life I would have preferred. It also wasn't a bad life. One night, I was having a lot of trouble sleeping. I'd been dealing with a lot more pain and discomfort than usual. I already called the nurse to up my dose of painkillers. I felt bad if I ended up calling her too often. I decided to deal with the pain for the night and just wait till morning. Sometime in the night, I thought I heard someone running down the hallway outside my room. It sounded strange. I woke up to the sound of bare feet pattering on the tiles. I sat up and watched the hallway for a bit. I was about to get out of bed when I saw something small and pale flash past my doorway. It made the same sound of bare feet running across the tiles. I instantly pulled my feet back into my bed. I wasn't sure what it was, but the sound was creeping me out. I stared at the doorway for what seemed like ages. Then I spotted eyes peering at me from the bottom of the doorway. A little boy was lying on the floor and peeking at me through the doorway. I almost screamed when I noticed him. His eyes were wide and sunken in. His skin was pale and his lips were blue. It was a cold night. My initial thought was of concern for the boy. I wanted to call for a nurse to take him back to bed before he got too cold. Then, at the back of my mind, a thought occurred to me that this wasn't a boy at all, but a ghostly apparition of one. I was 15, so thoughts like these were both common and also silly for me. I called to the boy. I asked what he was doing, or if he was okay. He let out a giggle and pulled away. The next thing I heard was his footsteps running back down the hallway and fading into the distance. Nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I asked the nurse if the children were allowed to move around the hospital at night. She said that they weren't, but that some of the more restless kids do manage to sneak past them. I didn't want to get anyone in trouble, so I didn't tell her about the boy that I saw. To this day, I'm still not sure if what I saw was a boy from the children's ward playing around, or if I actually witnessed a ghost of a boy who didn't make it. Story number 3. You might not believe this, but I hardly ever need to visit a doctor. I'm extremely healthy, and I've been complimented before on how strong my immune system is. I visited a doctor when I was a baby for general checkups and that, but after that I never really needed to go. One of the few times I went to a doctor's office really sticks out for me. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life. I didn't get sick or anything like that. I was messing around with my brothers. Since I wasn't just the youngest, but also the only girl, I was really trying to prove myself to them. Long story short, I fell off the roof, missed the pool, and broke my arm. At the time, we didn't know I had broken my arm. I was in a lot of pain, but my mother was convinced that it was just a bad sprain. She made an appointment and we went to the doctor the next day. Yeah, we won't talk about me having to deal with the pain of a broken arm for a whole day. Anyway, the majority of the doctor's visit went pretty normal. My mom was annoyed when the doctor insisted that my arm was broken. My mom demanded x-rays to make sure, and the doctor said they would have done that regardless. I was sitting in the x-ray room and the lady was positioning the machine by my arm. She retreated behind her shield, and I heard the loud hum when she turned on the machine. It wasn't long until I noticed her demeanor change. She was freaking out. She went into full-on panic mode, and I wasn't sure why. I watched her running around for a few minutes and pressing buttons. Then she left the room through the side door in her shielded area. She returned later with a doctor. I had to sit there and watch both of them panicking. At this point, I didn't know what to think. I thought there must be something seriously wrong with my arm. The longer I sat in that room, I started feeling really sick. I actually threw up. I think I passed out eventually because I woke up in a hospital bed with my mother crying her eyes out beside me. Now, I was unconscious for the entire experience, but the doctor explained it all to me when I woke up. The x-ray machine had malfunctioned. One of the tubes came loose and radiation was leaking into the room. The worst part was that they couldn't shut the machine off. I was exposed to a high level of radiation, which is why I felt so sick and passed out. They had me in an isolation unit for a while, but I was out for the whole experience. I suffered from a few side effects later, but I wasn't exposed enough for it to do any real long-term damage. I can't explain how terrified I was in that moment. My strong immune system didn't mean anything, and I could have easily died. Story number 4. I had a really bad childhood. This has nothing to do with my parents or the way they raised me. I was a problem child. I was constantly getting into trouble and wanting to run away. It got to the point when I was doing some really bad things. I was in a bad place mentally, and it was starting to show in some of the worst ways. I'm in a better place now, but it got so bad back then that my parents decided to send me into a mental hospital for a week. This was so that the doctors could assess me and find out exactly what was wrong. I can't really talk about my stay there since there isn't really anything to talk about. It sucked for the most part. I hated the food, I was bored out of my mind, and I found most of the people staying there with me either annoying or stupid. During my stay, my roommate started freaking out one day. They were a pretty chilled guy from what I can remember. He kept to himself and was really quiet. They say that you should never trust the quiet ones. I'm not sure what set him off, but he just started screaming at the wall. He was sitting up straight in his bed with his mouth wide open and just screaming at the top of his lungs. Obviously, the nurses rushed in straight away and subdued him. He didn't fight back or anything, he just kept screaming. That night I was laying awake in my bed, mostly because it was kind of hard to sleep when my roommate was groaning all the time. They had tied him to his bed and given him a sedative. It wore off in the middle of the night, and he was determined to keep me awake with him. I was just staring at him when he suddenly snapped his head to look at me. His eyes were wide, and he had the most dead serious expression in his face. He looked straight at me and said, "I'm going to kill you." I'll never forget that moment. I was frozen in terror. He was so serious about it that I could tell it wasn't a joke. He meant it. I was so glad that he was tied down to that bed. The next day, I told the nurses what happened, and they were just as shocked as me. They moved me to another room and made sure to keep my roommate tied to his bed for a little longer. Eventually, my week-long stay ended, and they diagnosed me with a mild form of bipolar disorder. My life changed from that point, and I got a lot better. I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes after having a nightmare of my roommate breaking through his restraints and coming to kill me. Story number 5. I want to start this story by stating that I don't think all doctors are bad. I just had a really bad experience with one. In fact, it was a nurse that ended up saving my life after the doctor made a horrible mistake that almost killed me. I should state that I am deathly allergic to this one chemical that is used in the majority of painkillers and sedatives. I don't want to get technical, and I'm not even sure how to spell the chemical. Whenever I have to go to the hospital or do anything that involves medicine, my mother usually writes down that I'm allergic to the chemical, and the healthcare professionals react accordingly. It makes their job really difficult, as they have to really think about the chemicals used in whatever medicine they give me. One day at school, I had a really bad migraine. I got them often, but this one was extremely bad to the point where I had started screaming during one of my classes. They kept me in the nurse's office until my mom arrived to take me to the doctor. My mother handled everything while I just sat there in pain. A nurse finally came to escort me to a doctor's room, and I sat there for another 5 minutes. The pain had subsided at this point, but it was still pretty bad. When the doctor finally arrived, my mother had gone out to get some coffee. I was completely alone, and only 10 at the time. The doctor looked both bothered and uninterested. I could tell his mind was elsewhere. He basically just glanced at my file and made his decision, which was that I was in a lot of pain, so he should obviously give me some pain medication. He told me he was going to give me a shot of something. I can't remember the name of the medicine now, but I recognized the name back then. I had come to recognize certain names of medicines that I wasn't allowed to take because of my allergy, and I knew that the doctor was about to give me that exact medicine. I protested his decision instantly, but he didn't listen. In his mind, I was just a little kid that decided to be difficult. He was in a hurry to get somewhere else, and he wasn't interested in anything I had to say. He tried to force the medicine on me, and that's when I started screaming for help. A nurse ran into the room demanding to know what was happening. The doctor tried to defend himself and say that I was being difficult. Then I told the nurse what medicine he was trying to give me. She lost it. She was there when my mother was filling in my file and explaining my allergy. She grabbed the syringe from the doctor and threw it across the room. She started yelling at him about reading my file and how he could have killed me. Then my mother came back into the room, and it only got worse from there. Long story short, we never saw that doctor again. I'm not even sure if he kept his job after that. I could have died in that room had it not been for the fact that I recognized the one name of a medicine that I couldn't take.